Okay, so welcome everybody to the Patent Literacy Symposium, I'm thinking Literacy Symposium already. Look at that. That's coming next June. Welcome to Patent Series, celebrating the 20th anniversary of the publication of Hollis Scarborough's Reading Rope. My name is Dr. Pam Kastner. I have the honor of serving as Patent State Lead for Literacy. Joining me this evening is my amazing colleague and friend, Jeannie Hertzler from our Patent Pittsburgh office. And I'm almost calling this Nancy Squared tonight. As you know, Nancy Hennessy has been with us from the beginning with this series. She will be co-leading this session this evening with the equally amazing Nancy Eberhardt, and I'll be conducting their bio in just a moment. This is a kind of a little bit of a difficult evening. As many of you know, we were very fortunate at Patent to have a long-term professional and friend relationship with William Van Cleave. He was, as many of you know, truly one of a kind, an absolute literacy giant, and his passing has left an enormous hole in our hearts, but also in the literacy community. There have been and will continue to be a number of tributes for William, and to honor his legacy. Patent is also doing one of these tributes. And I have been placing in the chat box a link on the Patent Literacy Resource Hub, where you can also contribute to this tribute for William. As you know, William loved language. And we thought one way that might really honor him, but also delight him, would be to write a 6-word story. Ernest Hemingway was challenged at one point to write a narrative, a true story, in just 6 words. And he did. It was amazing. So you can check that out on our resource hub. I'll give you a little teaser there. But we thought that might be one way, because that would be pretty challenging. You know, William loved a challenge too, for folks to remember William with a 6-word story. So you can add a 6-word story there. There are some guidelines there to support you. You may upload, if you have a photo of William with him, or when he was presenting, or any photo that you would like to upload for William, there's a place to do so. And also a place to upload a video if you want to do a short video. We are curating all these resources until September 30th. And then we're going to be working on integrating them for a tribute for William. So I know many of you, just seeing the names here, you learned so much from William. We hope this would be a way that he would like for us to honor him. So thank you so much for doing so. Okay, so let me introduce you to the 2 amazing presenters that we have this evening. I'm going to start with Nancy Eberhardt. Nancy's right up next to me in the corner. Maybe she can wave there real quick. Hi, Nancy. Nancy Chapel Eberhardt is currently an educational consultant and author. She has experience as a special education teacher, administrator, and professional development provider. Nancy contributed as author and co-author to the development of the literacy intervention curriculum Language. More recently, she collaborated with Margie Gillis to develop the Literacy How professional learning series. Nancy is the co-author of Sortigories. Oh, I have so many, sorry, Sortigories 3.0, a web-based app that provides practice with decoding, vocabulary, and syntax to improve reading comprehension and fluency. She serves as a member of IDA's Perspectives and the Examiner editorial boards, and is a board member of the Reading League Connecticut chapter. Thank you so much for being with us this evening, Nancy. And then Nancy Hennessy, let me share her bio with you. Nancy Hennessy is an experienced teacher, diagnostician, administrator, and literacy consultant. She holds an undergraduate degree in psychology from Regis College, a graduate degree from special education from the William Patterson University, and has completed advanced studies in administration. While in public school, she provided leadership in the development of an innovative programming and curriculum development for special needs students, a statewide revision of special education code, and developed an award-winning professional learning initiative for high school educators. She has worked across all grade levels in both special and regular education, and has also served as an adjunct instructor for the Farley Dickinson University. Nancy is a former Wilson language lead trainer and a national trainer for language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling letters. She has developed keynote addresses, workshops, and training to educators nationally and internationally on topics including professional development, strategic planning, RTI, co-teaching, components of proficient reading and writing, and dyslexia. She wrote the chapter, Mentoring in a Professional Community, in the Reflective Mentor, Case Studies in Creating Learning Partnerships, co-authored the revision of Module 6 of Letters, Digging for Meaning, Teaching Text Comprehension, and authored Chapter 11, Word Learning and Vocabulary Instruction in Multi-Sensory Teaching of Basic Skills, 3rd edition. Nancy has been both editor and contributor for International Dyslexia Association's Perspectives on Language and Literacy, issues on adolescent literacy and morphology. Her book, the amazing book, The Reading Comprehension Blueprint, Helping Students Make Meaning from Text, was recently released. She has held various positions for the International Dyslexia Association, including President, Branch Council Chair, and National Conference Chair, and is currently on the North Carolina IDA Board. She served on the National Joint Committee for Learning Disabilities for several years and recording for the Blind and Dyslexia for Learning Ally Advisory Board. She is an honorary member of the Delta Kappa Gamma Society, the 2011 recipient of IDA's Margaret Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award, and received NCIDA's 2012 Orton Award. So as you can see, we have very, very esteemed presenters this evening that will walk us through language structures, focusing on the rope. So I give it to Nancy and Nancy Squared tonight. Thank you so much for teaching us all about syntax.
Thank you so much. I think I need to give you a much shorter bio, but I think from that bio, you can tell I've been around for a bit. So I appreciate all those kind words. So this evening, we're celebrating 20 years of Scarborough's Rope, and we're doing that by focusing on syntax and skilled reading. And yes, we are Nancy Squared. And so I'm Nancy Hennessy, and Nancy Eberhardt is joining me, and I am just thrilled that she was willing to do this. I'm honored to be co-presenting with her. I want you to know that you have support materials for this evening that you can access. We've provided a PowerPoint handout, also a research article abstract, an abstract of some of the articles that I'll be talking about this evening. And then Nancy has prepared an interactive handout for you. I would like to tell you that in thinking about this and researching really the role of syntax and skilled reading, that many of the studies come out of the speech and language field. So we owe a great deal to our speech and language pathologists who continue to remind us about the importance of oral language and then the connection to written language. One individual that stands out that I'll be mentioning this evening is Cheryl Scott, now retired from the field, but really it is the reading of Cheryl Scott that stirred my initial interest in this topic, and I think continues to stir the interest of many. So I will cite her this evening, and you do have one of her abstracts. We've organized our talk this evening around two critical questions. What can research tell us about the role of syntax in reading comprehension? And I'll be directly addressing that. And I'm going to do that by first talking a bit about language comprehension, and then talking about the complexity of syntax, and also then making direct connections between syntax and text or reading comprehension. And then Nancy will be taking on how does this knowledge translate into informed instructional practices. So let's begin by thinking a bit about the reading rope, this wonderful visual metaphor for skilled reading that develops over time, that Hollis Scarborough has provided for us as a communication tool. And I thought as we looked at these two bundles that comprise the reading rope, word recognition and language comprehension, I should again remind us that we're focused on the upper strands of the bundle, the language comprehension strand, and this evening it's all about language. All right. And of course, Hollis, in designing the reading rope, indicated that language structures include syntax and semantics. These two are really, just as the reading rope, the strands are woven together. Semantics and syntax go together. It's very difficult to separate one from the other. Certainly the words are conveying the meaning, but the order of the words allow for us to then structure that meaning. Hollis has also provided us with some, I think, words that convey to us the importance of this language structure strand of the rope, specifically syntax. And she says to us, even if the pronunciations of all of the letter strings in a passage are correctly decoded, the text will not be well comprehended if the child does not know the words in their spoken form. So certainly the semantics, the word meanings. But here, for this evening, cannot parse the syntactic and semantic relationships among the words. And also then indicating the importance of background knowledge so that the students are able to go below the surface of the text and make inference. I also want to call attention to that very last line. Note that in such instances, reading comprehension deficits are essentially oral language limitations. So once again, she's reminding us of the fact that it all begins with an oral language base, and we're going to be repeating that and weaving that into our conversation this evening. I also wanted to point out to you, while the reading rope is a visual metaphor, we do have theoretical models that provide a bit more information, a bit more foundation for understanding how important syntax is. And syntax lives within linguistic knowledge or language comprehension. For the reading systems framework, which of course is a very comprehensive theoretical framework developed by Chuck Perfetti and colleagues, they talk about the fact that in order to have proficient reading, one has to have in place linguistic and writing system knowledge. And when they talk about the linguistic system itself, what is that knowledge? They talk about phonology, syntax, and morphology. They also, as they begin to kind of parse this out and think about these varied contributors under the umbrella of these different types of knowledge, they speak to the lexicon, all right, all of those word relationships that we have, that we bring to text, and they include here syntax. We also can take a look at cognitive foundations for reading acquisition, based in, of course, the simple view, but expanding out and making us think further about these two components of the simple view, specifically the language comprehension component. And here, again, we have linguistic knowledge, all right, coming to the surface as being critical for making meaning. And what comprises, or what are the contributors to linguistic knowledge? Well, of course, we have syntactic knowledge being pointed out. And I think in reading Hoover and Tummer, they talk about the fact that, yes, you need to be able to identify the meanings of the words, but it's the way in which those words are placed within a sentence, within a structure that allows for us to make meaning of the overall text one by one, those sentences adding up to the meaning of the text. If we think about this from the perspective of the reader interacting with the text, the levels of language processing that's necessary, Kane and Oakhill also elaborate for us further on the importance of syntax and sentence comprehension. And of course, they talk about the fact that when the reader comes to the text, what the reader needs to be able to do is certainly read the words, all right? We're not diminishing the role of word recognition here, but we're focused on the role of language comprehension. So access the meanings of the words, so that strand of the rope vocabulary. And at the sentence level, they need to work out the syntactic structure and sense of each of these sentences. They also go on to talk about the integration of meaning within and between sentences and the incorporation of background knowledge, with the goal being that the reader interacting with the text will construct what is called a mental model. And so thinking about, when we think about reading comprehension itself, what we want our students to be able to do is walk away with this overall understanding that the author has conveyed. And it's not just resigning at the surface level of the text, but it's below the surface level of the text. We need to bring our background knowledge to it, along with these other contributors. So I think you can see the strands of the rope very nicely represented in Kane and Oakhill. The one we're focused on, though, this evening, again, language structures, specifically syntax. And then when we think about the mental model, we can think a bit about the fact that we have Walter Kinch, who brought forward the construction integration theory for us. And so you might be saying, where did that mental model stuff come from? Well, he talks about the fact that as we integrate meaning, as we aggregate successive units of meaning, all right, we hopefully arrive at this mental model. And at one level, at the microstructure, in terms of cognitive processing, we're working with what? We're working with that surface code. That's the word meanings. And it's also these idea units or propositions, all right? That's the syntax. That's the sentence, all right? And these idea units are connected. How? They're connected through semantic and syntactic relationships. That, in combination with this broader view of the text, allows for us to construct this overall understanding. So if we needed to have a rationale for why are we talking about syntax, why are we talking about sentence comprehension in terms of reading comprehension, in terms of text comprehension, this is a sampling of what the research has told us, what it has taught us. Now, the second topic I'd like to address under this umbrella of research, what has the research told us? I'd like to talk a little bit about the complexity and contribution of syntax. And so I think when one steps back from this, one often thinks of syntax as not necessarily being multidimensional, but in fact it is. And in an article that Kate Kane wrote, which you see represented here, syntactic awareness and reading ability, is there any evidence for a specific relationship? She points out the fact that it's a mistake to think about syntax as a unitary construct. And when I read that, I thought, wow, that sounds like the way that we talk about comprehension. It's not a unitary construct, it's multidimensional. Well, so is syntax. So I think having the terms, having the lexicon allows for us to understand that we're really talking about something that takes a deeper understanding in terms of how it affects our students' ability to work with the text and to make meaning. So here's just a few definitions that I've pulled out that I will be using this evening and that Nancy will reference, I think, as well, and that we should all at least have a basic understanding of. So syntax, of course, the internal structure of a sentence. You might be thinking syntax word order, and that would be on target, right? But then we can talk about syntactical knowledge. And oftentimes the research studies, what the individuals doing those studies are doing is they're tapping into whether or not the student has syntactical knowledge, whether it's implicit, which is this ability to work with the meaning, to extract meaning from sentence constructions, or whether it's explicit. All right, and this is more related to what we often call syntactical awareness. This is this awareness and ability to manipulate and reflect on the grammatical structures of the language. And I'm sure at some point as I was talking, syntax grammar was running through some of your minds. And then we can talk about syntactic forms, all right? Well, these are actual grammatical categories into which words fall, like parts of speech. But perhaps for us as practitioners, our focus very often is and needs to be on syntactic function, the role of words in sentences. In other words, understanding what's the role of the subject, the predicate, the noun, the verb, the adjective, the adverb, and so on. So just some distinctions. And another reason for making these distinctions is the following. It's sometimes difficult, all right, in terms of the research to separate out all that's going on because syntax has all these varied aspects and different assessment tools are measuring these different aspects of syntax. And it's been difficult to identify the true nature of the contribution of syntax to text comprehension because of this complexity, right? But important that we understand that, but we also recognize the contribution of syntax. And so take a moment and just read this statement here on the left. I'll just give you a moment to read it. Sorry. And I think what's important for us to take away from this is that syntax is really providing a structure. It's a structure for ordering and organizing idea units within the sentence. Idea units is sometimes called propositions. And on the right-hand side of the screen, what you see are some statements that come from the research study that Paulson and colleague did. And of course, there's the representation of it, and you have the research abstract for it. Who did what to whom, the relationship between syntactic aspects of sentence comprehension and text comprehension. And what they're really telling us up front, first of all, is the importance of syntax and how syntax allows for these meanings to be integrated so that the reader doesn't have to infer what meanings the words are actually conveying. So they give an example. John teased Bob. And when we understand syntax, when we understand the way in which it orders meaning for us, structures meaning, we know immediately that John is the who or the what, right? And teased is the is or was doing, and to whom is Bob, all right? And so we don't have to work at that. That comes to us because we have this syntactic knowledge, right? We also, through reading of the varied research studies, can come to the conclusion that an understanding of sentence structure, an understanding of how syntax works, does make a contribution. But at the same time, if we don't have the ability or have the syntactic information, or our processing is slow, this can lead to limited understanding, misunderstandings. So in this particular study, what they were looking at, obviously, is the role of these different words, the different functions, how syntax contributes to text comprehension, and how individual differences in understanding certainly is related to text comprehension. All right. So here's a caution before I move on to the next topic that I want to talk about in terms of the research. And this really relates back to the conversation I was having with you a few moments ago about Kate Kane and the fact that syntax is not a unitary construct and so on. And this here is the work of Cheryl Scott back in 2004. And her pointing out, and this still holds true today, that because of this complexity, it's easy to establish the association, but it's difficult to kind of unravel and understand the true nature of the relationship, right? And she makes the point here that syntax as knowledge is difficult to isolate from syntax as process. Any one syntactic structure or task that might be chosen for study is a small slice. And I think that's important for us to understand. So when you read the research, you really have to go searching, first of all, of the articles that directly relate to text comprehension. And then you really have to read them carefully in terms of exactly what is it that they're looking at. Think a little bit about just those terms I was talking about, whether it's syntax, syntactical knowledge, explicit, implicit, and so on. And last but not least, and I love that she pointed this out, reading is a developmental process that takes place over several years. So it's important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about this relationship that exists between the individual's oral or general syntax and their reading comprehension. And one of the things that we should keep in mind about the reading rope, so here's the connection to that, is the fact that that is a developmental model, right? Hollis Scarborough clearly stated that this occurs over time. Now, she clearly states that when she talks about it, when she talks about the chapter itself, but in the chapter, the original reading rope, that arrow moving along the bottom that said over time was left out. And so if you see any reading ropes that she might, when you see her put her reading rope up, she often will add that arrow down below. So developmental in nature, so important that we keep this in mind. All right. So we've talked now, first of all, about what the research has kind of brought to the fore in terms of language comprehension and the connections to syntax and its importance in terms of overall reading proficiency and reading comprehension. And we've just talked a little bit about the complexity of syntax, but also the contribution that it makes to proficient reading and reading comprehension. So now we're going to target a little bit more the direct connection to reading performance. And I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of the student and the text, and then the instructional context. And here again is Cheryl Scott. And Cheryl Scott, this is, I believe, a seminal article, A Case for the Sentence in Reading Comprehension. She's written others. There's a very good article by her in the summer of 2013, Perspectives, IDA Perspectives. There's also a very good article in that Perspectives issue by Nancy Eberhardt. But in this particular article, Cheryl Scott points out for us the fact that there's evidence that supports the connection between syntax and reading comprehension. She points out why sentences can be difficult. She points out some of the clinical implications and interventions. In later years, as I heard her speak, she also talked about the fact that there was not a great deal of connection made in Common Core, that oftentimes professional standards for educators do not attend to the syntax or sentence comprehension connection. Love this, the way that she describes this. I see syntax, read it with me. I see syntax as the vehicle, even workhorse of meaning. As such, it is also a vehicle, not the only one, but a major one, for acquiring the knowledge base needed for reading comprehension. If this vehicle is flawed, it will not transport the knowledge very well. If any of the strands of the rope are frayed, then skilled reading is in jeopardy, right? So this wonderful vehicle for conveying meaning. Well, what do we know about this vehicle from the perspective of the reader, all right? Which readers struggle with this? What has the research told us about this? And UCATS in 2006 and colleagues found that students who were categorized as poor comprehenders in grade 8 performed poorly on tests of complex sentence comprehension in kindergarten, grade 2 and 4. These are usually oral production, all right? And he was looking at, with his colleagues, assessments that relate to grammatical awareness, for instance. He's done subsequent studies that confirm. In grades 9 and 10, students' oral sentence comprehension performance explained variance in text comprehension after controlling for vocabulary and reading fluency. This is a study done with adolescents, looking at the contributions and the contributions and the coordination of syntactic awareness and syntactic knowledge. This is Bremo and actually Kenna Appel and others in 2015. And then last but not least, yet another citation. So we can find citations throughout. And I said very often the citations have to do with students who have specific language impairment, but we also know that struggling comprehenders, that students that have learning disabilities, EL students, often syntax presents as a barrier. Now, we also have to talk a little bit about the text and why the text might be problematic and how it contributes in terms of reading performance. What's the role of syntax? And one of the things that we know as students move through the grades, as they encounter disciplinary text, expository text, that these texts are oftentimes very difficult. Both narrative and expository texts are written in academic language as you move up through the grades. Expository tends to be more difficult. So Thompson and Shapiro talked about the fact that, sentences can be difficult when? Well, they're complex and difficult when you have a number of propositions. Those are idea units. How many ideas? They're difficult when you have a number of embeddings, phrases or clauses that modify pre or post. The order in which major elements appear within the sentence. Well, active versus passive voice, for instance, typically we're looking for subject, verb, object. Also, the distance between crucial elements in the sentence. So where's the who, where's the do, and what's in between? Is it a long distance dependency? Robert Zippoli, all right, in a later article that we'll be talking about in a moment, also talked about some of the sentence structures that readers might find difficult. And this is very similar, talking about passive verb, talking about adverbial clauses. For instance, clauses that begin with after, temporal, or because, causal. Center embedded relative clauses, right? Smack dab in the middle of a sentence begin with that or who or which, and then sentences with 3 or more clauses. In summary, then Mads Poulsen says to us, guess what? There are some syntactic structures that pose difficulty for in terms of accuracy and reaction time, even into adulthood, even for some of us, right? It's possible that the ability to deal with sentence structures can be a limiting factor in text comprehension. Well, let's just try that out for a moment. Take a moment and read this sentence that you see at the top of the page. So this sentence appeared in a chapter that Cheryl Scott and her colleague wrote in the Handbook of Literacy and Language. And when you begin to really think about this sentence, what's going on? Well, you've actually got 3 propositions or idea units. The verbs generally signal those. You've got 2 levels of embedding. You've got after using arguments, and that continues a little further along about global warming. And then popped right in the middle of that, you've got a relative clause that most reasonable scientists had rejected many times, right? And then you move on and you look at the journalist was admonished by the editor. Well, that's not subject, verb, object. Who was admonished? All right. And who did the admonishing? Oh, the editor actually admonished. So we could have further conversation about this, but you begin to get the sense as one begins to deal with academic language, how difficult this can be. And Scott, again, gives us some really good information. If a reader cannot parse the types of complex sentences that are often encountered in academic text, no amount of comprehension strategy instruction will help. And then we have the instructional context. Well, when we talk about the instructional context, we have to begin to think about what's our responsibility as educators? How do we help develop some of these competencies that are necessary for students to deal with the text? And this is the work of Balthazar, who has written with Cheryl Scott and her colleagues. And she's actually talking about a study in which they looked at grammatical interventions for students who were struggling with the grammar of text. But what's important for us to come away from this with is that they're pointing out to us how important it is that we develop the oral language, that this understanding of sentences in the oral modality is really critical in terms of reading comprehension. And that some of the research has shown that the oral sentence language abilities are just as instrumental in supporting reading comprehension as the classic heavy hitters of word reading and vocabulary. How about that one? All right, so here's a study that really kind of supports that, not kind of, does support that. And it's a study done by Duncan and colleagues, and they're talking about not all sentences are created equal. Well, what they did was they looked at basic sentences and difficult sentences. And basic sentences they defined as those that we often hear in oral language and we see in written language. And difficult sentences were those sentences that contain some of those more complex characteristics that we just talked about, right? And the reality is what they found is this was 5th graders, all right? They found that children continue to draw on their strong oral language foundation to support reading comprehension even in this grade, even as they encountered texts that contain more complex and diverse sentences. That understanding of basic sentences they described as a springboard to reading comprehension. And they included, I love this, an educational impact and implication statement. And I think we can all figure out what they probably are telling us or are definitely telling us. All right. Yeah, we need to build things like vocabulary skills, in particular oral language as a whole, but we also have to be building sentence comprehension as this underlying skill. So the importance of oral language. All right. So I also wanted to point out, and I'm finishing up now, so my colleague will be able to transition. The ability to understand sentences contributes to student reading comprehension. But we all know, right, that many of our reading programs, never mind the development of oral language, they're not looking at or emphasizing explicit instruction aimed at enhancing students' knowledge of sentence structures, right? It's important that we develop orally, but also in writing. This is Robert Zippoli, again, and he's saying to us, look, many of us, clinicians alike, educators, we don't have the syntactic knowledge and instructional skills needed to support our students' comprehension. We didn't get that in our foundational courses or later on. This is not something that many of us have had experience with. And so he wrote a very nice article that you see there on the side, and you have the research abstract in which he provides some direction for us in terms of general guidelines, specific strategies, assessment, and so on. And so I'm going to end now with just some general guidelines that he provides to us. So many diverse learners, including students with language impairments and learning disabilities, will benefit from receiving instruction in both the oral and written modalities. So this connection in terms of the instructional context. And many students will benefit from being taught about sentence structure by strategically integrating reading and writing. And Nancy and I had many conversations preparing for this about this connection. And teaching will be more effective when explicit instruction on sentence structures is combined with opportunities to practice skills during activities embedded within the general education curriculum. So we're not talking about isolated skills. We're talking about working with what it is that the student is reading, right? And giving them opportunities to understand how syntax then is contributing to meaning. So my question was about research, and I'm going to stop sharing now, and Nancy is going to talk about the translation of knowledge. And thanks so much for being here this evening. All right, Nancy. And I'll take a look at the chat as well while you're talking.
There we go. Thank you, Nancy. As I was sitting and listening to you, sort of mesmerized by all of the information, I was reflecting on how many times you mentioned oral language and reviewing the people who have influenced my knowledge in this area, which, by the way, I came to very late in my career. And I want to, before I go on and talk about what you see before you, it's people like Tori Green from Language Circle Enterprises, Jane Green from Language, Judith Hockman from the Writing Revolution, Margie Gillis from Literacy How, Charlie Haynes, who wrote Speaking to Writing, and of course, William Van Cleave. If we think about all those people who have influenced what you're going to see for the remainder of this evening, it's that they really are building this written language understanding of syntax upon an oral language base and really bringing that to life. So I want to jump off of the last person that Nancy was talking about, Richard Zippoli, because he said something very important, which she actually highlighted, which is the ability to understand sentences contributes to students' reading comprehension. However, many reading programs tend to underemphasize explicit instruction aimed at enhancing students' knowledge of sentence structures. So for that reason, for the rest of this session, what we want to do is take a look at some of the essential content that's required for us as educators, us as teachers, to be able to teach students at the syntactic level or to comprehend better using that syntactic knowledge. Now, the graphic we have in front of us is from none other than Nancy Hennessy, and it just does a beautiful job of breaking down from left to right the components of meaning, aggregating from words up to text, basically what we have to know ourselves in order to be able to teach that to our students. Whoops, I gotta get to the right place here. And one of the other beautiful parts of what we're going to talk about for the rest of the evening is really wrapped up in this quote from Wilhelm Humboldt, who was quoted by, or who Noam Chomsky quoted as saying that language is a system that makes infinite use of finite means. And what is so heartening about that, and is also elegant and exquisite, is that when we understand but 8 grammatical elements, 4 types of sentences, we're able to do just incredible things. But it's really grasping what those elements are that we are about for the rest of this evening. And then Margie and I in our work tried to bring this down to that finite number of grammatical components then makes it possible to build an infinite number of syntactical structures, which I just marvel at. When you think about every book, there are only a few structures in there. Really quickly, the grammatical elements are our building blocks. What I want to emphasize here is you know what they are, but tonight what we want to stress is the first bullet, which is that each element serves a specific meaning-based function. That is what is so different about what we are talking about in terms of making grammatical and syntactic knowledge help us with our comprehension. Because if we understand the function that these different elements are playing, it allows us to unlock meaning or to figure out what we're not understanding in terms of our text. So I'd like to do what I call a brief but spectacular run through the parts of speech, only so that we have these building blocks in mind. And what I want to emphasize in that process this evening is what are the cueing questions? What are those meaning function questions that each part of grammatical part of speech has to do? So we have our nouns, our adjectives, and our pronouns, and they're a set. They're all the same color for a reason, because they work together in some way, which we'll look at in just a moment. Verbs and adverbs are another important component or building blocks. And as Nancy said, these will be our doers. And they're the same color because they work together. And then the sort of unsung heroes of our language are the prepositions, the conjunctions, and of course, we couldn't function without interjections. But backing up one, just to prepositions and conjunctions, what we're going to see is that these words, while few in number, actually have an enormous role in holding our thoughts and language together. So let's take a look at each of these as we go. Very quickly, the nouns are the namers of our language. They are naming all those people, places, and things in our world. And our cueing question is who or what did it? Or as some people say, the doer. I'm going to be using a few examples from a wonderful picture book, City Dog, Country Frog, just because I love the pictures and the story is adorable. But we have here some text. And in these 2 sentences, I have a word that's highlighted that is a namer, dog in the first sentence and farmhouse in the second. But if you look at the other words in the sentence, you'll also pick out some other namers or nouns that are not necessarily serving in the role of the subject, which is another part of what we want to talk about. Namers come in the person, things, dog, boat, house, places, a state, the woods, a farmhouse, or ideas, love, idea, justice. Now, adjectives tell us more about those nouns, and we have very specific questions that adjectives answer about the nouns. They tell us how many, they tell us what kind, or they tell us which one. And those are the roles, those are the functions of those words we would call adjectives. So we have how many can be either an actual number like 1 or 2, or it could be a more general number like many or several. Those adjectives that tell us what kind have to do with attributes, color, shape, size, curly, smooth. And And then the last group of adjectives identify which ones. They are the parts, the types of adjectives that set apart the named object from another one. So for example, in those two pictures in the lower left, if I asked about the dog, you might say which one, and you'd either have to tell me the dog at the end of the leash or the dog against the tree. That would be the only way I would be able to differentiate which one you're talking about. Then there are pronouns, and their role is to replace the nouns. And we know these as those that answer who, the he, she, they, or what, it, and they. And the cueing question is the same for a pronoun as a noun because they're basically serving the same function. And in those sentences we saw before, we can see the role of the word he in the first sentence and it in the second as a replacement for the previous namer. Then there are our verbs, and this is where we get into the do, and most verbs tell what the namer is doing. And what we like to talk about here is the question is, did what? And we, in this case, if we look at this picture, we see that the dog is moving in such a way that we would say the dog jumped, and that's the action. The other set of verbs that we have link information, and that they answer the question, is what? And these are by far more abstract for our learners because it's more like an equation as opposed to having that action to rely on. Adverbs are the words in our language that tell us more about the action, and they again have specific questions: where, such as here or in the country, and when, like later or in the spring, how, such as sadly, as fast as he could go, or why, such as consequently or because he was hired. But those, when a word or group of words answers those questions, it's telling us something about the verb. In the interest of time, we won't do this, but I want to use this picture as an illustration that any book, be it a children's book or an older book for an older student, you can turn into a grammar lesson by asking the students the questions about the text and the illustrations that they are looking at. Prepositions are, as I said earlier, one of the unsung groups of words in our language because they signal the relationship between words within a sentence or within a paragraph. Prepositions begin a phrase, and some of those phrases answer those adjectival questions that we were just looking at. So for example, the frog with big eyes, it's with big eyes. That prepositional phrase beginning with is telling us about the frog. What kind of frog? It's not the frog with green skin, it's the frog with big eyes. Which one? In this case, it's the frog on the rock as opposed to the frog in the pond. And again, it's helping to provide that information about the noun. Similarly, we have prepositional phrases that answer the adverbial questions, where, when, and how, and we can see the same idea. And what's different about adverbial prepositional phrases is notice that sometimes they come after the action, such as the dog ran across the wide field. But we can also move adverbial prepositional phrases before or in front of the action, such as during the summer, the city dog taught country frog, and that still makes sense. We can't do that with the adjectival prepositional phrases. They generally follow the noun. And then conjunctions. This is a super important group of words, and they come in two varieties. One variety are coordinating conjunctions, and the other are subordinating. one joins equal parts, the other joins unequal parts. And William had a technique where he would put his hands together and say, if they're equal parts, our hands are together, and if they're subordinating, they go under. And sort of using that as a signal sort of visually helps us understand what's different about these two kinds of conjunctions. But coordinating conjunctions and, or, but, those will combine equal subjects or equal predicates or equal sentences. In contrast, the coordinating conjunctions such as because, although, since, after, if a clause begins with one of these, it can't stand on its own. It becomes dependent. And therefore, that makes that difference between being equal versus being subordinating. And then, of course, we need to have our interjections, which are the way we express emotions, such as or gee whiz, or any of the other expressions that you might have heard. So let's take a moment for you to, this is in your interactive handout, if you have had a chance to print that out, is identify these elements. This is compliments of my colleague, Margie Gillis. Take a moment to see if you can identify those 8 parts of speech or those 8 grammatical elements in this sentence. All right. Hopefully everyone saw that yikes is our interjection, and adjective my husband, and so on. But what I want to do is concentrate on what happens on the next example to some of these words that might have been an adjective or a verb as we look into the next example. Yikes, a black jet overhead completely surprised my husband and me. Now, in this case, those same words, black jet, have now become an adjective and a noun. And then in the next sentence, the surprised tiger bolted quickly out of view. That word that surprised, that was a verb, now is it working in the role of an adjective. And what these sentences are illustrating is the difference between looking at these grammatical elements as something to be labeled versus working on stressing with our students the importance of understanding the role that they play, the function that they play. So beyond the identification of these parts, which is really ground zero of being able to then manipulate them, is to be able to arrange them to make meaning. And that is what we want to focus on next. Syntax, that is the sentence level work that Nancy was talking about earlier, is where many things, critical things happen. It's where we interpret word meaning. It's where we determine punctuation use, develop fluency through phrasing, clarify ambiguity. We all laugh when we have a dangling participle, but it's because we're trying to figure out where did that participle belong that has to happen within that sentence. And understanding the basic sentence structure of who did what to whom. So let's take a look at each one of those ways that sentences bridge the word to text. Interpreting word meaning. Words with multiple meanings, of which we have 40% of our English language is made up of words with multiple meanings. We will not know what the meaning is until we put that word into context. So for example, we will not know the meaning of season, a period of a year, or flavored added to food, until we put them into sentences. In the first, we're now talking about the time of year. In the second, we're talking about the flavoring of food. Determining punctuation use. In fact, again, it isn't until we look at the grammatical knowledge of the function of the word trees, in trees branches versus oak trees, that we know whether it should be possessive in the first case or plural in the second. We've all experienced children perhaps even adults who, once they know about apostrophes, put them in all the time when adding an S. And it's because the understanding of the function of that punctuation and the morphological marker, the difference between it as a possessive versus a plural marker, is all about that function. Also, and Lynn Truss wrote a wonderful book that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. And there's a humorous explanation of what the panda that goes into the bar and orders a meal and then shoots and then walks out. And that's not what it means, but pandas eats, shoots, and leaves. And that's where, what a difference a punctuation mark can make. But I love the way that Lynn Truss frames this, which is that punctuation herds some words together and keeps other words apart. It really directs how we read. And it is one of the things that I think gets underemphasized when we're working with children. They run right over the punctuation, like running through a stop sign, because the impact on meaning isn't necessarily understood, something we really need to be teaching. So here is a cute example in an illustrated version of a book by the same author. Look at that huge hot dog and look at that huge hot dog. If you were to close your eyes and visualize what's different between them, they're the same words, except for this one comma, what would be different? Well, the difference is, in the first case, it's a huge hot dog. In the second case, it is a huge dog that is hot. So the use of punctuation is critical as part of our knowledge of syntax. Developing fluency, word order impacts meaning even at the phrase level. We don't have to have a whole sentence to see the importance of this. So let's take the two words, blue and sky. We can arrange them as blue sky, sky blue. One means the color of the sky, the other means a shade of blue. And it is the function of the word sky in the first phrase is a noun, naming the space around the earth. The other is now an adjective describing the color of blue. While this is a simple example, it is something we can start working on very early on with children of what happens when we change the order of even two words in this way. Also, bringing forward those questions of who did what, when, where, and so on, we can use those cueing questions to help students develop prosody, that phrasing when they're reading. So we want students to read until they've gotten the who and the do. The city dog didn't stop. Then we can show them to read on that first day is answering a question, when. In the country answers where, and so on. And as we teach students to apply that script in their head of these cueing questions, we move them away from reading word by word and instead have them begin to read in meaningful word groups, which improves their comprehension and their fluency. We mentioned earlier the role that sentences play in helping us untangle ambiguity. In reading this sentence, the lady bumped the man with the umbrella. What makes this sentence unclear? Take a moment, think about that. And how can that ambiguity be clarified? I wish we could talk. This is when I feel as though I'm talking to the Black universe and I have no feedback. But I'm sure that some of you are thinking, well, we don't know a lot. So let's just see how we might untangle that. The lady bumped the man carrying the umbrella. In this case, the word carrying clarifies which man. So if we added a word, we could clarify it was the woman who bumped the man and the man was carrying the umbrella. But in the second case, the lady bumped the man with her umbrella. Now we know that she was the one carrying the umbrella and the man was the one who was bumped. In the first iteration, we weren't sure whose umbrella we were talking about. And it's that kind of slightly unclear text that we want to avoid when students are writing, and certainly we want students to pay attention to when they're reading. Now let's go to that wonderful quote from Stanley Fish in How to Write a Sentence, in which he talks about words sliding into these slots. And I think some of the points that Nancy was making earlier about the foundation that oral language plays for us is that we already, by the time we're getting ready to read and write, we already have a working understanding of those slots because we say things in mostly a correct order. But to be able to now understand this and actually to write sentences, which these two are so reciprocal, is really what this beautiful quote from Mr. Fish is about. Then Nancy said something I thought was even more elegant in terms of instruction, which is the reader must figure out the logical relationship between words to construct meaning. And those relationships are conveyed through different types of sentences, which now gives us a teachable moment. What are those different types of sentences? So the most basic one is who did what to whom. And as she was saying, Nancy was saying earlier, that's the easy order. That's an additive who, doer, and what did it get done to. And using my story, the city dog taught the country frog, that's in that order, but we could change it around by simply switching that the country frog then taught the city dog, which indeed in the story did happen. But it does make a difference in what order we sequence those who's and do's. Now, those four types of sentences are simple, in which we have a subject, waves, and crashed. The second sentence is also a simple sentence, and it's important to keep in mind that simple doesn't necessarily mean short. We can have more words and have it still be a simple sentence. Compound sentences are those where we use those coordinating conjunctions, the and but and so. And in this case, the waves grew is a simple sentence combined with people ran for safety. And that and is combining these two equal pieces. Complex sentences are where we use these subordinating conjunctions, and we end up with clauses that cannot stand on their own, but they serve to either add adverbial in the first case or adjectival information in the second. The waves, which were as tall as a house, is describing the waves. And when the tsunami hit the coast is telling us where the waves crashed. And then the most complicated of all of our sentence types is where we put compound and complex together. And in this case, we have the subordinate conjunction, not conjunction, clause, as the enormous waves approach the coastline. And then we also combine these two parts of the sentence, which I can't see. The water thundered and the people raced in the other direction. So we have all components, the compound and the subordinate clause, which makes this a complex compound sentence. So how does grammar then relate to text comprehension? Some wonderful work from McNamara and her colleagues in creating, among other things, the Cometrics text analyzer tool came up with some pretty powerful information for us in terms of what kinds of parts of speech or grammatical elements occur in informational text versus narrative text. And so What they found out was that in the informational text, there's a greater propensity for using nouns and adjectives because we're talking about people, places, things, and ideas, and all of the descriptors that go with that. But we also tend to have those longer noun phrases that we were listening to Nancy talk about earlier, which tend to make sentences more complex to digest, to dissect. And we tend to see more frequent use of passive voice, which is not that linear order that's easier to track. In contrast, with narrative text, we have more familiar words. This is something children are doing orally from early on, telling us stories. And then the narratives are full of action words, typically, or more action verbs and adverbs, and then the use of pronouns, all of which are easier to do. And in fact, the Cometrics tool sorts out the difficulty of the text according to whether it is informational or narrative according to these variables. So this brings us to the important point. If these are the things we need to learn, or for students to learn, and for us to, as educators, to teach, namely those grammatical parts, how they get arranged, and the various types of sentences, then I think Jane Green said it really well, is that the level of syntax direct teaching focuses on the varieties of ways that words can be arranged to create and modify meaning. And Nancy mentioned a paper that I did for Perspectives, and it was because I couldn't find a paper that talked about direct teaching of syntax that I decided I would write one, because all I could ever find about direct teaching had much more to do with teaching code emphasis parts of our language, not grammar and syntax. But all of those features, cumulative, explicit, making it concrete, all those features are the same things we need to adapt or to apply when we're trying to teach grammar. So, however, David Crystal points out that grammar does not need to be dry, arcane, or pointless. It can be alive, entertaining, and relevant. And one of the words I'd like to really draw attention to in here is the word relevant. And what I think has brought a lot of relevance to the work of people like Judith Hochman and Charlie Haynes and others is partnering up our work on syntax with learning content, learning informational text, because in the process of understanding the namers, the nouns, the actions, and so on, with content, we're doing double duty. We're learning what those parts are, but we're also acquiring information, which I think is so powerful for us to consider. So what we're really talking about is applying a function-based approach to instruction. If we shift from a focus on labeling, which is what I grew up with, which made no difference at all in how I understood text or wrote anything. But if we shift from a focus on labeling to a focus on function and meaning, grammar and syntax take on a greater role and utility in improving comprehension. So let's take a look at some of the ways that we can do this. Frankly, all of the ideas so far are instructional possibilities, but now I'd like to just take a few minutes to go through a few examples. First of all, what we want to do is identify function first and then label based on whether they're adjectives or adverbs and so on. So the part highlighted in green or in each of these sentences, yesterday, at dusk, as the sunlight faded, which of our functional questions do those words answer? I hope you're all saying when, because that they all answer when, whether it's one word, a phrase, or a clause. And once we're good at doing that, the next step to label it an adverb or an adverbial phrase or an adverbial clause is a much simpler step. Then those technical terms, if you will, allow us to communicate our meaning about what kind of phrase it is. But first we had to understand its function. We can also use the text. I know you probably are thinking I'm getting royalties on the city dog and country frog, but I'm not. This is just an adorable story, and I have these examples. But we can take a sentence and we can then identify within that little passage or that sentence phrases or words, and then we can sort them according to the question they answer. In the fall, answers when. On the rock, answers where. Together, answers how. And by having children begin to see that words and phrases are really answering informational, meaningful questions, helps us to gain both fluency and comprehension. Now, about this time, a little entertainment, I think, would be good, a little movie. And thanks to Literacy How, I'm going to show a little clip about sentence building. And the mentor, Elke here, is going to illustrate how they use decodable words to do this. So let me just start this. Okay, I'm going to move along. Okay.
Who, so that means it could be a person, a place, or a thing, or an animal.
Can you hear?
Or does it tell me an action? Is my word an action word that I'm reading? All right, so let's read this first word together. Oh, let's find, I see that was fast. Is run, is that a who, or is that something we do? It's something we do. Can you put it under the do column, please? Okay, is it a who or is it something we do? Can you make your fingers hop? You can, if you can make it happen, it's something that you do. There. All right, so now we have who's and we have do's. And in order to make a sentence, you have to have a who and a do. You get to choose who you want to talk about and what they're going to do. And we're going to start off our sentence where we're going to say
With a capital letter.
with a capital letter. So now say this. The
Frog swims.
good. You want to use it? Pull that over. All right. And look what you said, swims, and that's so great. Guess what I have? I have your S there because we don't say the frog swim. We say the frog
Swims.
And then what do I have to, what do you think is on my last card?
Period.
All right, can you say your sentence now? Go ahead and say it.
The frog swims.
Have your students say it. You're the teacher, say, okay, everybody say the sentence.
Okay, everybody sing the sentence. The frog swims.
Okay. Now, can you,
Now, I'm going to continue on in the interest of time, but she then illustrates changing up the frogs, puts the S on the frogs, swim. And by using a simple example, shows how the verb and the noun and the verb, subject and the predicate have to agree. And it's just a lovely example. Whoops. Now, another example of sentence building is something I'm working on with my colleague Cheryl Ferlita with sortigories, and that and this is similar to some work that Charlie Haynes has done in his most recent work, where we give students a formula or a sentence, an equation of what we want in the sentence. We give them some possible words that could be used to build this sentence, and start by having them look for the what did it and did what, and then arrange them, the words or phrases to create a sentence, and then showing them at the end how it looks with a capital and punctuation. We can then increase the difficulty of that as they know more of the parts by adding how many, what kind, and all of these components. Ask them to then read the words and solve that sentence puzzle by now saying how many, a dozen, what kind, hungry, and so on. And by doing that, we're having the students think about what the words mean, how do they get assembled to create a meaningful sentence. And then we really want to spend a moment now on text cohesion, because this is where grammar and comprehension join forces. And those, what I called unsung heroes of pronouns and prepositions and conjunctions, are part of what helps us connect meaning across across sentences. So pronouns are one of the ways we do that, where if we have the parrot's feathers, we can refer to them by using the pronoun they. But we have to know that what word this is referring back to and why it's feathers and not leaves. And that's part of our instructional process. Another way that we need to help build cohesive ties is by understanding that synonym substitutions, that is another way to say the same thing, other than a pronoun, can be used to build that cohesion from sentence to sentence. So in the first sentence, it's the word berries. And then in the next sentence, that's the word the ripe fruits is a synonym for that. And then one more example here. We can also have an entire phrase be replaced by a single word. And those kinds of synonym substitutions are important to help students understand what they're reading across text. Kane says that reading comprehension requires the reader to integrate meaning across sentences. So it is those pronoun connection, it is the use of the subordinating conjunctions that help us make those connections of meaning. And then to interpret and use the interpretation and use of connectives when reading is critical to text cohesion. This was another point that McNamara and her colleagues stressed in the development of the Cometrics tool. In fact, to the point that they categorized referential cohesion, meaning those that have to do with pronoun and the synonym substitutions that we were just looking at, versus those that were deep cohesion, where the cohesion was being driven by the use of words like after, next, then, which is a very different kind of linking of information across the text. So when or should we begin to teach grammar and syntax? I've already revealed my hand a little bit this evening that I think we should start as early as possible to let kids in on some of what's going on when they're reading the text. So this little 3-sentence sequence from Whole Phonics allows us to illustrate that we can teach pronoun reference. We can teach the students that the word he is referring back to Gus, not the bugs. And then we can also show with the use of the word but and so that Gus was having a fun time, but something's going to change. Things aren't going to stay the same when we hit the word but the bugs bug Gus. Well, because of that, we have another change, which is he runs to his tub. And this is a silly story, but the point is we can and should be drawing students' attention to these words within text as soon as we can. And then I mentioned earlier on the work of Tori Green, and one of her strategies or one of her techniques, more than a strategy, was to help students trace what Mary Shepard-Grohl refers to as the referential chain. How does the writer identify and then continue to refer to what the article is about? I think we've all had that experience where a student will read something and get to the end and won't be able to tell you the who or what the whole thing was about. My most memorable example of that was a student who read the paragraph and looked up and said, I can't understand this because I don't already know it. What I had to do in that case was to say, well, who or what were we talking about? And in this situation, you probably can see, and this again is a relatively simple example, but to make the point that when we can have students learn to trace, to track the namer, the noun, the pronouns, and the substitute naming options within the text, what we're helping them do is to maintain cohesion, they're tracking, but we're also, at the end of the day, we're helping them learn to pay attention to the most important thing is what were we reading about? So my last example for the evening is from Judith Hochman's work. And I had the opportunity to hear her speak just a few weeks ago and saw this graphic. And while it's dealing with sentences for writing purposes, if you notice, these are all to do with writing. What I really, and Nancy and I talked about this, what really caught our attention was, look, what sentence is where we make contact with the electrical. You know, this is where it all happens. So I've said to Judith, I want to be able to share this and imagine that this is meaning running around the outside, and all the things we've been talking about are the connections within the light bulb that make the sentence, that the sentence is activating, that help us make all those meaning connections. And so while we're talking about Judith Hochman, she has done a wonderful job of helping us move from the more obvious, the more traditional sentence structures, like the big black dog chased its favorite tennis ball. And while that sentence is additive, it just keeps stringing information in a sequence that is predictable, one that we're very familiar with. But then to help students understand that we can take all those same words and rearrange them, and what happens in the second sentence, what makes this more difficult? It's what Nancy was talking about earlier, which is we've separated the dog from its verb is big and black with this phrase that says that chased tennis balls. And so all the words are the same, but look what happens by simply embedding a clause in between the parts that are the basic sentence structure. And then explicit instruction, Judith Hochman, again, has become very popular and known for her work on teaching students to use what they're reading to answer questions, to expand a sentence based on because, but, and so, where the because tells us why, but indicates a change in direction, and so signals cause and effect. So in this case, we start with a sentence frame, and this is what can come directly from whatever the student's reading about, whatever that content area is. And by answering the question, or by answering, or not answering, completing the sentence following the word because, we get a certain kind of thinking about two chemicals failed to react. Well, because they had gotten wet. Then we ask, but, so the two chemicals failed to react, but provided students with opportunity to investigate what happened. And then the third is two chemicals failed to react. So what happened because of that? What was the result? The teacher repeated the experiment with dry chemicals. What's remarkable is that simple, quote unquote, simple activity applied to all kinds of content has the first the impact on improving oral language, oral production, which then translates into better writing, and also it improves our comprehension. So in closing, and as Pam started out, tonight's sort of a tribute, not sort of, a big tribute to William Van Cleave, who always said syntax matters, and indeed it does. So I'd like to end by having us consider syntax matters because, think to yourselves, syntax matters, but, and syntax matters so. And with that, I'd like to leave, I think, a minute or two for a question, Pam.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Nancy. My friend Jeannie Hertzer texted me during this, and I lost internet for a while. Sorry about that. But she
Oh,
texted
yeah.
and said, yeah, it was a little stressful for her a little bit there, but it all worked out. She said, I think William's smiling.
Oh,
I do. I think he's smiling. I did have the honor of doing an interview with him, and in that interview, he said, syntax is my superpower. And I think that both the Nancy Square, Nancy Hennessy and Nancy Eberhardt, you have syntax as your superpower too. So thank you so much for an amazing evening. There were a few questions. Jeannie's going to ask them out, and while she, you're responding to those, I'm going to place in the chat here real quick. That did not. Yeah, it did. Did it go out? Nope. Sorry about that. Let me go back and copy it again. I'm placing at the date for our next session, which is September 28th. Dr. Kate Kane will be joining us for verbal reasoning. Oh my goodness, what an honor, just as it was this evening. I'm also putting the link there in again for our tribute for William. Please contribute to that. And I did place in there the dates for the Patent Literacy Symposium that's coming up September 14 to 16, 2022. Please save the dates. That'll be here before we know it. And I'll have Jeannie take the questions, and then I'll put the form in for those folks who need Act 48. And you're getting lots of thanks in the chat. I hope that you're seeing that, Nancy and Nancy. So
I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Pam. So I just wanted to make a note. The Literacy Symposium, Patents Literacy Symposium will be June of 2022. I think maybe you said September, Pam, so I just want to make sure.
oh, did I? Oh my goodness gracious. That internet stressed me out.
That's
for sure.
okay.
That kicked in June 14, 16,
We just wanted
2022.
to make sure they understand it's in the summer.
Thank you.
So Nancy's, if you wouldn't mind answering a few questions, we have just a couple. The first was, do you recommend using mentor sentences for instruction? And if so, are there any resources you can recommend? That's from Lindsay.
So do you want to take that one, Nancy? And I can add my 2 cents.
I would say absolutely. I think that having students see examples of a mentor sentence is very helpful. Off the top of my head, I'm absolutely not coming up with a resource. Nancy, maybe you would know one. But I think that the whole point is modeling what we're after and analyzing what the structure is that makes it a good mentor sentence. And I think that analysis process is what is so critical to using the mentor examples.
Yeah, I very much want to encourage teachers to use sentences from the text that their students are reading. And so beginning, if you're using decodable text, as Nancy has beautifully pointed out, that's a beginning. That's a place to start with your students. And then as you use more complex text, you can do the same. And you can certainly take sentences from the more complex text and simplify them and add some of those questions. I think, when we think about building meaning, we build meaning by aggregating these units of meaning from the word to the sentence, to the integration of the sentence, to the background knowledge. And so thinking about the text that you're teaching, think about it with that lens. So thinking about or considering, can you pull from and then build a knowledge of?
Thank you. That's great advice. Carly was wondering, is it better to label parts of speech in a sentence, like above each word, or is it better to do the old-fashioned diagramming?
Ooh. I think they're really serving a different purpose, honestly. And I've used both. The labeling process is certainly showing you, if you're doing what we were saying earlier, which is first being sure you understand the role the word's playing before worrying about what part of speech it is. I think what's so beautiful about diagramming as a component of the instruction is visually showing the relationship that isn't necessarily unveiled when a sentence is in a linear fashion on the line. So that when we were talking about adverbial phrases can be before or after, you really understand its relationship to the verb when you can move it on a diagram under the verb. So I think it really has to do with purpose. Interestingly, one of the groups when we used diagramming a lot with in language exclamation was English learners loved the diagramming, and there was something about seeing that relationship that seemed to make a difference. So part of it might be your audience as opposed to which is better.
I think that was a great answer, Nancy. I also would just like to add, and Nancy made this point beautifully, start with the function first. Begin with what questions do those words answer? How are they contributing to meaning? And then going to the labeling of the actual form.
William used to say over and over and over again, form trumps function. Function trumps, excuse me, function trumps form. Function trumps form. Yeah, I can hear him saying it. He would like, Pam Casser, what did you just do? Function trumps form.
Well, that was a really great segue into the next question, which was, how would you suggest approaching complex sentence structure and nuances of language that are impacted by syntax with our English learners? And I don't know that your answer would be any different. It seems that explicit instruction is good instruction for all, but if you'd like to expand on that.
The only thing I would say, and Nancy, please jump in, and that is, I think if you deconstruct the complex sentence into the series of components so that and which I think is really different than doing the diagramming. I think that allows for each component to be understood, and then you can reassemble it. I think that is one of the most useful, that deconstruction of the components in understanding what is making up that complex sentence. One of the examples I've used a lot is if you take everything out of the preamble to the Constitution, which is like, I don't know, some extraordinary number of words, it really comes down to 3 words or 5 words. But it's what we need to do is help get to the core of what the sentence or the simple sentence within all of those many words. One of the other strategies that I have found helpful, and it's why knowing those prepositional phrases can be helpful, is for students who are having trouble identifying the who and the do in longer sentences, is to have them cross out prepositional phrases and look at what's left. And what's left is usually a much smaller amount to try to grapple with, to figure out the who and the do. And then you can say, well, what were all these other words contributing to the meaning of that sentence? So maybe some of those strategies would also be helpful to our listeners.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also say, thinking about what's basic, and then you're building from that in terms of what becomes more advanced. That article that Cheryl Scott and Catherine Balthasar, little tongue twister, wrote for Perspectives issue 2013, they talk about more advanced types of clauses and phrases, and have some questions that go along with. So it's explicit, it's the breaking down, it's cumulative, and so on. Yeah.
And I'd also, along those lines, the article by Richard Zippoli has a wonderful set of resources as part of that article. And I really would recommend, for those of you looking for practical, that his articles is a gold mine.
Yeah, so you have the abstract and the research abstract summary. You don't have the article itself, but you can find it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes, we have that document on the Padlet for everyone to access. And I know we're just a little over time, but this is a great question. I'd just like to end with this one. How would you assess, or what assessments might you use to best identify what errors students might have when it comes to struggles in reading comprehension when it's related to syntax?
Go away. Take it away.
Most of the assessment instruments live in the world of the speech and language pathologist, and so they're a very good resource for us in terms of better understanding when students are having difficulty with syntax, grammatical awareness, and so on. One also can think a bit about some informal ways of assessing sentence comprehension, and perhaps what we could do is I can extract some of those suggestions that I have in my chapter on sentence comprehension, and we can put them in this Padlet. Last but not least, I would also say, you know, the measures that we're often using for reading comprehension are screening measures, you know, like our maze and our days. It's nice if we can identify something that takes us a little bit beyond that. And actually, Acadians does have a diagnostic, short in length. It's called the CFOL, C-F-O-L. It's comprehension, fluency, oral language. And as part of the oral language component of it, it taps into syntax. So you might want to take a look at that. It's published by Voyager Socris, but it's CFOL. And we don't have that kind of informal, well, it's actually a formal diagnostic, but it does not take a huge amount of time to administer. It really helps you target, zero in on the different subtests that you want to use. So.
Thank you so much, ladies.
For putting that in there. Big thanks to my colleagues I saw jump in, Sherry Hartman, Donna Helpman, and Dr. Laura Moran, and to Jeannie Hertzler. Thank you so much for facilitating, co-leading this with me tonight. Once again, thank you to the Nancys. It was a beautiful job. And William would be
Eberhardt.
so happy. So we'll see you next time, September 28th, in this series with Dr. Kate Kane. All right. And so everyone have a wonderful evening. This recording will be up on the Padlet, I would say, in the next couple of days. So if you have colleagues who have not had a chance to join you this evening, please share it with them. That Padlet also has all the recordings and resources from this series. We want it shared widely. So thank you so much. We're here for teachers and kids. All right. Have a wonderful time. Be safe and sound till we see you next month. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.